had warts all over his body, including his genitals. His lymph nodes were swollen. He was in bad shape. He stayed in the hospital for a while, and at the end of 1968, he was released in more stable condition. But he showed back up again at the emergency room in March of 1969, just drowning in lung fluid, couldn't breathe, horrible yeast infection in his mouth and his throat, couldn't swallow, and now a strange purple lesion on his thigh. He was in no condition to speak, and he lasted a couple more months till he succumbed to a high fever and pneumonia. The doctors who treated him were just really perplexed. They had no idea what was wrong with this kid. And one doctor in particular, she would go home at night and she would dream about him. She would dream about him taking his test for his driver's license and going to the prom. But mostly she would have nightmares about the horrible way that he died. And after he died, they conducted an autopsy, and it was just really baffling that purple lesion, and they also found these lesions on internal tissues, was Kaposi sarcoma, which is really weird. Kids don't get Kaposi sarcoma. It's a rare form of skin cancer that elderly gentlemen get from Mediterranean and Jewish descent. And the pneumonia, it was caused by pneumocystis carinii, which is a fungus that we all have in our lungs, but our immune system deals with it. Nobody dies of that. So she couldn't get him out of her mind, and she had this ominous feeling in 1969 that someday the mystery of what killed him, why he died, would be solved. So she kept his tissues and his blood for many, many years in cold storage. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about the early AIDS epidemic, particularly Reagan administration's response to it, infighting between researchers that slowed down the progress of understanding the disease, and our country's blood bank's response to the disease. So first of all, the Reagan administration. In 2011, we marked the 30th anniversary of the AIDS epidemic. So that was 1981 that the CDC started reporting strange cases in San Francisco and New York of young men dying of strange symptoms. Reagan didn't publicly talk about AIDS. He didn't publicly utter the words until September of 1985, and just really briefly at a press conference. Incidentally, he talked about it the month before his friend Rock Hudson, the actor, succumbed to AIDS. And just to put in, he didn't really talk about AIDS in depth until 1987, a full 6 years after the onset of the epidemic. And just to put the funding in perspective for you, in 1976 there was an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease that killed 50 people. And the year after, $9 million have been spent in research. Between 81 and 82, 1,000 people had already died of AIDS, and just $1 million was spent that first year on AIDS research. So that was the Reagan administration's slow response to the epidemic. Now, secondly, progress on the epidemic was slowed down by infighting between researchers. In 1983, just 2 years after the onset of the epidemic, a French laboratory called the Pasteur Institute believed that it had isolated the virus that caused AIDS. And they wrote up a paper, they sent it on to eminent researcher Robert Gallo in the United States, along with samples of the virus. And Robert Gallo, the reason that he's eminent, he discovered the T cell and how the T cell functions. The T cell is the blood cell that fights infection. And he also discovered the retrovirus HTLV1, which causes leukemia. Now, leukemia causes T cells to proliferate, whereas we know HIV causes T cells to die. So Robert Gallo added things to his paper. He believed that HTLV1, the virus that he had discovered, was related to HIV. And he kind of sneakily filed a patent for the discovery of HIV, even though it wasn't called HIV at the time. Well, the French found out about that soon after and believed that they had discovered HIV, so they filed a patent on Robert Gallo's Hills, and there was this dispute over who actually discovered the HIV virus that really slowed down antibody testing for HIV. And incidentally, despite all of Gallo's contributions to the study of AIDS, he stole the HIV virus from the French. He did not discover it. He presented the exact same virus, which would have been impossible, that the French had initially forwarded to him. And in 2008, the French won the Nobel Prize for discovering the virus, and Robert Gallo was not a part of that, winning of that prize. So that really slowed down the ability to test for HIV, which didn't help the blood banks. The FDA didn't approve an antibody test for HIV until 1985, so 4 years after the epidemic. So there was no testing of the blood supply. However, the blood banks had been given warning after warning, and CDC, the Center for Disease Control, had recommended that blood banks test for hepatitis because it was found a lot of people who had HIV were also suffering from hepatitis, but that was ignored. Spokespeople from the blood banks kept saying it's a 1 in a million chance, it's 1 in a million chance. In the meantime, a whole generation of hemophiliacs has died. So in 1987, a more sensitive test for HIV was developed, and that doctor who originally treated Robert Rayford had his tissues tested, and he indeed was HIV positive and succumbed to AIDS in 1969. So this kid was the first documented case in North America of anyone dying from AIDS. Now, in the late 90s, medications were developed, and people with HIV are now surviving much longer. But in the meantime, 34 million people worldwide have died of AIDS. It's estimated there's about 1.5 million people in the US living with HIV, and about 400,000 between the age of 13 and 25, kids really. It's just important that we don't forget this terrible epidemic and the mistakes our country made in handling it. Now that there are treatments for HIV, we don't want to see children like Robert Rayford succumb to this disease unnecessarily, so please don't forget him.